It was just a crushed tin of baby formula. That was all it took to unravel a web of lies, murder, and mafia bloodlines. Chloe stood at the pharmacy counter, her hands shaking as she begged the clerk for a refund she didn't deserve. She needed the cash to keep her infant son alive. But what Chloe didn't know was that the shadow lingering near the pharmacy's back office wasn't just another customer. It was Dominic Russo, the most ruthless crime boss in the city. He saw her desperation. He followed her into the freezing rain. And what he uncovered behind the peeling door of her run-down apartment would bring the entire underworld to its knees. The smell of stale grease and burnt coffee clung to Chloe Bennett's uniform like a second skin. It was 11:45 p.m. on a miserable Tuesday, and the neon sign of Rosie's Diner buzzed with a rhythmic, dying flicker. Outside, the Chicago rain lashed against the greasy front windows, turning the city into a blur of streetlights and shadows. Chloe wiped down the last Formica table, her muscles screaming in protest. She had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her manager, a heavy-set man named Pete, who always smelled of cheap cigars, tossed a crumpled envelope onto the counter. "Your cut of the tips, Chloe," Pete grunted, not meeting her eyes. $32. Slow night." Chloe's heart sank into her worn-out sneakers. $32. It wasn't enough. She offered a tight, exhausted nod, slipping the envelope into her coat pocket. Her mind was a frantic calculator, crunching numbers that never added up. Rent was due in 4 days. The electricity had a shut-off warning taped to the door. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was Leo. Her sweet, 6-month-old baby boy was burning up with a fever, his small chest rattling with a cough that terrified her. Dr. Ayres at the free clinic had written a prescription for a strong antibiotic, but it cost $56 out of pocket. With her tips, she was still $24 short. She had only one option left. Tucked deep inside her canvas tote bag was an unopened premium can of baby formula she had received from a local church pantry 2 weeks ago. It was expensive. Retail price was easily $30. She just needed a store clerk taking pity on her to process a return without a receipt. 15 minutes later, Chloe pushed through the glass doors of Benson's Pharmacy on 4th and Elm. The bell chimed, a hollow, cheerful sound that mocked the knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. The pharmacy was a neighborhood fixture, smelling of antiseptic and dust, but beneath the surface, it was something else entirely. It was a front, a quiet, money-washing hub for the Russo syndicate. Chloe approached the register. The cashier, a lanky college kid whose name tag read Kevin, barely looked up from his phone. "Hi," Chloe started, her voice betraying a slight tremor. She placed the tin of formula on the counter. "I need to return this. My baby. He's allergic to this brand. I just need the cash back to get him the right medicine." Kevin sighed, finally looking at her, then at the can. "Do you have a receipt?" "No, I lost it," Chloe lied, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. "Please, it's unopened. You can scan the barcode. It's from this store." "Policy is policy, lady. No receipt, store credit only," Kevin replied, bored. "I can't use store credit," Chloe's voice cracked. She leaned closer, the desperate, raw edge of a cornered mother bleeding into her tone. "My son is sick. He needs antibiotics. I just need $24. Please look at me. I wouldn't be begging if it wasn't a matter of life or death." Unbeknownst to Chloe, she wasn't just pleading with Kevin. Through the slightly ajar door of the pharmacy's back office, eyes cold and sharp as obsidian were watching her. Dominic Russo stood by the manager's desk, a sleek black briefcase resting by his tailored Italian leather shoes. At 34, Dominic was the undisputed head of the Russo family, a man who ruled the city's underbelly with a terrifying, quiet intellect. He had come to Benson's simply to collect the weekly protection envelope, a mundane task he usually delegated, but he had been in the neighborhood. Dominic paused, his attention caught by the security monitor on the desk, which showed a live feed of the front register. He stepped towards the crack in the door, listening. He saw the way the young woman's drenched coat hung off her frail frame. He saw the dark, bruised circles under her eyes, the panicked heave of her chest. Most people in Dominic's world begged. They begged for their lives. They begged for more time to pay their debts. He was immune to desperation. It was the currency he traded in. But there was something entirely different about this woman. She wasn't begging for herself. There was a fierce, protective, almost animalistic devotion in her eyes that sent a strange, cold jolt through Dominic's chest. It stirred a ghost from his own past, a memory of his late sister, fiercely protecting what was hers. "I can't do it. The system won't let me give cash without a receipt," Kevin said, shutting down the register with a sharp click. "You have to leave, or I'm calling security." Chloe stared at the cashier, the last flicker of hope dying in her eyes. She slowly reached out, pulling the heavy tin of formula back against her chest, cradling it like a shield. A single tear escaped, cutting a clean line down her rain-slicked cheek. "Okay," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Okay." She turned and walked out back into the freezing storm. In the back office, Dominic Russo slowly adjusted the cuffs of his suit. He looked at the terrified pharmacy manager, Mr. Benson, who was trembling in the corner. "The envelope, Benson," Dominic said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. Benson shoved the thick manila envelope across the desk. Dominic didn't even count it. He slipped it into his jacket and walked out of the office, his eyes fixed on the front doors where the strange, desperate waitress had just vanished. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of the city, biting through Chloe's thin coat as she trudged down the slick pavement. Every step felt like wading through wet cement. Her tears mixed with the freezing rain, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She had failed. She had to go back to her freezing apartment, listen to Leo cry, and try to lower his fever with cold, damp washcloths and sheer willpower. Half a block behind her, a heavily armored, black Lincoln Navigator idled away from the curb, its headlights cutting through the downpour. Inside the cavernous, leather-scented cabin, Dominic Russo sat in the back, a tumbler of amber liquid resting untouched in his hand. His gaze was fixed on the small, shivering figure illuminated by the street lamps ahead. "Keep your distance, Silas," Dominic murmured. Behind the wheel, his most trusted enforcer and driver, a massive man with a scarred jawline, grunted in acknowledgement. "Boss, we're supposed to meet the capos at the club in 20. Why are we tailing a broke waitress?" "Because I want to," Dominic replied softly. It was the only explanation Silas needed. In the Mafia, Dominic's instincts were legendary. If Dominic saw something, there was something to be seen. But truth be told, Dominic couldn't fully explain it himself. He had seen thousands of broken people in this city. Yet, watching her clutch that formula, something about the angle of her jaw, the specific shade of her dark hair, tugged at a violent, unresolved knot in his subconscious. They followed her for 2 agonizing miles. She crossed out of Russo territory and into the decrepit, crumbling borders of the South Side, territory loosely claimed by the Moretti family, the Russos' bitter and bloodthirsty rivals. "She's walking right into the viper's nest," Silas muttered, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as they passed graffiti tagging the Moretti syndicate. "Just watch her," Dominic ordered. Chloe finally turned down a broken alleyway, approaching a decaying, 6-story brick building known as the Oakwood Tenements. The fire escape was rusted, and half the windows were boarded up with rotting plywood. Dominic watched through the tinted glass as she fumbled with a set of keys, glancing over her shoulder with the hyper-vigilance of a hunted animal before slipping inside. "Pull over," Dominic commanded. He picked up his encrypted cell phone and dialed a number. It rang once. "Yeah, boss," a sharp voice answered. It was Wyatt, the family's premier intelligence broker and hacker, operating out of a server farm in a secure warehouse downtown. "Wyatt, I need everything you have on a woman. She works at Rosie's Diner on 8th. Waitress, Dark hair, maybe mid-20s. Find out who she is, where she lives, and who she owes money to. Give me 2 minutes, Wyatt said. The sound of frantic keystrokes echoed through the line. Dominic stared at the 4th-floor window of the tenement, where a dim yellow light had just flickered on. Through the thin, ragged curtains, he could see her silhouette moving frantically. She was lifting something from a crib, a baby. "All right, got a hit," Wyatt's voice crackled back through the phone, sounding unusually tense. "Her name on the payroll is Chloe Bennett. Address matches the Oakwood tenements, apartment 4B. "And?" Dominic pressed, sensing the hesitation in his hacker's voice. "And, boss, this is weird. Chloe Bennett is a ghost. The social security number she gave the diner belonged to a woman who died in 1998. Her credit history, her bank accounts, her rental agreement, they all spring into existence exactly 14 months ago. Before that, nothing. She doesn't exist." Dominic's eyes narrowed, a predatory focus locking into place. "She has a baby. She told the pharmacist he was sick." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The sound of typing grew furious. "Boss," Wyatt said, his voice dropping an octave, "I'm looking at medical records, clinic logs, anything I can scrape from the city grid under her aliases. She's been taking a baby to a free clinic, yeah, a 6-month-old boy named Leo. But here's the catch." "Spit it out, Wyatt." "I pulled her medical screening from when she got hired at the diner. She had a mandatory physical for insurance purposes. Boss, Chloe Bennett has never been pregnant. Whatever kid she has up in that apartment, it's not biologically hers." Dominic ended the call, the screen of his phone going black. The silence in the SUV was absolute, save for the heavy rhythm of the rain hitting the reinforced roof. A woman hiding under a fake identity, living in rival Mafia territory, fiercely protecting an infant that wasn't hers. It wasn't just a sad story of poverty anymore. It was a calculated evasion. Someone was hunting her, or someone was hunting the child. Dominic unbuttoned his suit jacket, his hand lightly brushing the cold steel of the Sig Sauer holstered at his hip. "Park the car in the alley, Silas," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I'm going upstairs." The stairwell of the Oakwood tenements smelled of damp rot, cheap bleach, and decades of despair. Dominic Russo moved silently up the steps, his leather shoes making barely a whisper against the cracked linoleum. The flickering fluorescent bulb on the 3rd-floor landing cast long, jagged shadows against the graffiti-stained walls. This was deep Moretti territory. The fact that this woman, Chloe, had chosen to hide here in the very jaws of the Russos' most vicious enemy spoke of a desperation that bordered on madness, or genius. He reached the 4th floor. The air here was heavy with the muffled sounds of the city's forgotten. A television blaring a late-night infomercial, a couple screaming in a foreign language down the hall, and from behind the peeling, green-painted door of apartment 4B, the ragged, weak cries of a sick infant. Dominic paused, his ear inches from the wood. He could hear Chloe's voice, a soft, frantic murmur. "Shh, Leo, Mummy's here. I know it hurts, sweetie. I know. Please drink some water." Dominic didn't knock. He knelt, retrieving a sleek, titanium lock-picking set from his inner coat pocket. A man of his position rarely did his own dirty work anymore, but Dominic had grown up on the brutal streets of Little Italy before he built his empire. His hands remembered the mechanics of poverty. In less than 10 seconds, the cheap deadbolt clicked, surrendering to his skill. He pushed the door open, slipping inside with the lethal grace of a predator. The apartment was barely larger than a walk-in closet. The air was freezing. The radiator in the corner was dead and rusted. A single mattress lay on the floor, covered in thin, mismatched blankets. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single bare bulb, Chloe was hovering over a makeshift crib fashioned from a padded dresser drawer. She spun around at the sound of the door closing, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. For a split second, she froze. Then, survival instinct took over. Chloe lunged towards the small kitchenette counter, her hand closing around the handle of a serrated bread knife. She whirled back to face him, the blade trembling in her grip. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice tearing at the seams. She planted herself directly between Dominic and the crib, her stance wide. "Get out, or I swear to God I'll kill you. I have nothing to steal." Dominic stood perfectly still near the doorway, the dim light catching the sharp, patrician angles of his face. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes cataloguing the situation. The knife was shaking. Her knuckles were white. She was terrified, but she wasn't backing down. "Put the knife down, Chloe," Dominic said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, completely devoid of threat, yet commanding absolute obedience. Chloe flinched at the sound of her name. "Who are you? How do you know my name? Are you one of Carlo's men?" Carlo Moretti. The name echoed in Dominic's mind. So she was running from the Moretti underboss. The plot thickened. "I am not with the Morettis," Dominic said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward. "My name is Dominic Russo, and I am here because you tried to return a can of formula at my pharmacy tonight, and you are living under the identity of a dead woman. Put the knife down before you hurt yourself." Chloe gasped, the color draining entirely from her face. The name Russo hit her like a physical blow. She staggered back, hitting the edge of the crib, the knife wavering. "No, it can't be you. You're supposed to be in New York." "I came back early," Dominic said smoothly, though a sharp spike of adrenaline pierced his composure. She knew his schedule. Only Inner Circle syndicate members knew he had been in New York for the past month. Before Dominic could press the issue, a violent, rattling cough erupted from the crib. Little Leo wailed, the sound frail and wet. Chloe dropped the knife. It clattered against the cheap linoleum. She turned her back on the most dangerous man in Chicago, entirely consumed by the child. She scooped the baby into her arms, pressing her cheek against his flushed forehead. "Leo, stay with me. Breathe, baby. Breathe." Dominic stepped closer, his imposing frame looming over them. "He needs a hospital." "I can't take him to a hospital," Chloe sobbed, rocking the infant frantically. "They'll run his blood work. They'll log him into the system. Carlo's men have eyes in Cook County General and Mercy Hospital. The second his DNA hits a registry, they'll come for him." "Why?" Dominic demanded, his voice suddenly sharp, cutting through her panic. "Why would Carlo Moretti care about a waitress's child?" "Because he's not mine," Chloe cried out, spinning to face him, tears streaming down her face. "He's not mine, and if Carlo finds him, he'll kill him." Dominic looked down at the infant in Chloe's arms. The baby was swaddled in a faded, blue blanket. His small face was bright red with fever, his breathing shallow, but as the baby shifted, the blanket fell away from his tiny neck, revealing something that made the blood in Dominic Russo's veins turn to absolute ice. Resting against the baby's collarbone, tied by a thin, reinforced silk thread, was a heavy gold signet ring. It was heavily worn, bearing the crest of a roaring lion clutching a rose. Dominic stopped breathing. He recognized that ring. He had watched his younger sister, Isabella, slide it onto a chain around her neck the day she married a man their father forbade her to see. Isabella had died in a horrific car fire 14 months ago. There were no survivors, or so the police and the Russos had been told. Dominic reached out, his hand trembling for the first time in a decade. He gently brushed his fingers against the gold ring. "Where did you get this?" Dominic whispered, his voice a lethal, deadly hiss. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Chloe with a terrifying intensity. "Where did you get this ring?" Chloe pressed the baby closer to her chest, her jaw trembling, but she met his gaze. "His mother gave it to me, before she died." Dominic's vision tunneled. The room seemed to tilt. "Isabella," he breathed. "She said if I ever ran out of places to hide, I was to find Dominic Russo," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking. "She said you were the only one who could protect him. But I was so scared. Isabella told me the hit came from inside the family. She didn't know who to trust. The pieces violently snapped together in Dominic's brilliant tactical mind. Isabella hadn't died in a random accident. It was a hit orchestrated by Carlo Moretti, facilitated by a traitor within the Russo family. And this baby, this feverish, fragile boy in the arms of a starving waitress. "He is my nephew," Dominic stated. It wasn't a question. It was a vow. For 3 agonizing seconds, silence reigned in the freezing apartment, broken only by Leo's strained breathing. Then Dominic moved. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He became a machine of pure, calculated authority. He pulled out his encrypted phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. "Silas," Dominic barked. "Boss?" Silas's voice came through, alert and tight. "Get Dr. Harrison. Tell him to meet us at the primary safe house on the Gold Coast. We have a pediatric emergency, severe respiratory infection, high fever, have an oxygen tank and broad-spectrum antibiotics waiting." "Understood. Moving now," Silas replied, the engine of the navigator roaring to life through the phone speaker. Dominic hung up and turned to Chloe. "Pack whatever you need. We are leaving. Now." Chloe hesitated, her grip on Leo tightening. "I can't just go with you. I don't know you. Isabella said you were ruthless." "I am ruthless," Dominic said, stepping within inches of her. His proximity was overwhelming, smelling of expensive cologne, rain, and cold steel. "Which is exactly why no one will ever touch this boy again. You kept my blood alive, Chloe. You starved yourself. You lived in this filth to hide him from the Morettis. I owe you a debt I can never repay. But right now, my nephew is dying. Are you going to let me save him? Or are we going to stand here, arguing until his lungs give out?" Chloe looked into his dark, storm-grey eyes. She saw violence there, yes, but she also saw a fierce, unyielding, protective fire. She nodded once. "I don't have anything to pack," she said softly. "Everything I care about is in my arms." "Then we go." Dominic stripped off his heavy, waterproof overcoat. He draped it over Chloe's shoulders, wrapping it tightly around her and the baby to shield them from the cold and the rain. The coat swallowed her small frame, but it was incredibly warm, radiating his body heat. He ushered her out of the apartment, keeping his body positioned between her and the open hallway. He drew his Sig Sauer 9mm from its holster, holding it flush against his leg. The paranoia that had kept Chloe alive for 14 months was now merging with Dominic's lethal tactical awareness. They made it down the first flight of stairs. The building was eerily quiet now. Too quiet. The blaring television on the 4th floor had been turned off. Dominic paused on the 3rd floor landing, his instincts screaming at him. He held up a hand, stopping Chloe. "What is it?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the shadows. "We are not alone," Dominic murmured. The heavy front doors of the tenement, 3 stories below, suddenly shattered inward with a deafening crash. The sound of heavy combat boots hitting the lobby floor echoed up the stairwell. "Clear the floors! Carlo wants the girl and the brat alive, but if she runs, kneecap her." A harsh, raspy voice barked from the ground floor. Chloe let out a strangled gasp, burying her face into Leo's blanket. "It's them! They found us." Dominic's mind raced. How had they found her tonight? The pharmacy. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The pharmacy manager, Benson. Benson was a coward. When Dominic took the envelope and left to follow Chloe, Benson must have recognized her from a Moretti bounty flyer and tipped off Carlo's men to save his own skin. "Listen to me," Dominic said, grabbing Chloe by the shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Do exactly as I say. Keep your head down, keep the baby covered, and stay behind me. I will not let them take you." Chloe nodded, tears welling in her eyes, terrified but resolute. Heavy footsteps pounded up the stairs. 2 men dressed in dark tactical gear rounded the landing on the 2nd floor, their weapons drawn. Dominic didn't hesitate. He didn't give a warning. He was a Russo, and his family was threatened. He raised his Sig Sauer and fired twice in rapid succession. Crack, crack. The suppressed shots were sharp and efficient. The first Moretti hitman dropped instantly, a bullet taking him perfectly between the eyes. The second man shouted in shock, raising his submachine gun. But Dominic fired again, taking out his knee and then his chest before the man could pull the trigger. "Move!" Dominic barked at Chloe. He grabbed her elbow, pulling her back up the stairs. They couldn't go down. There were at least 6 more men entering the lobby. "Where are we going?" Chloe cried over the sound of shouting from below. "The roof," Dominic commanded. He hit the speed dial on his phone as they ran up the remaining flights. "Silas, the tenement. We are compromised. Moretti hit squad, at least 8 men. I need an extraction on the roof, and I need it 2 minutes ago." "I see them, boss. I'm calling in the cleanup crew. Hold the roof," Silas replied, his voice deadly calm. They reached the top floor. The fire door leading to the roof was padlocked. Dominic didn't bother picking it this time. He aimed his weapon and blew the lock apart with a single shot. He kicked the heavy metal door open, pushing Chloe out into the freezing, torrential rain. The Chicago skyline loomed around them, shrouded in mist and storm clouds. The wind whipped violently across the tar-papered roof. Chloe stumbled, clutching Leo desperately to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of boots pounding against the metal stairs behind them grew louder. The door burst open. 3 Moretti soldiers spilled onto the roof, assault rifles raised. "Drop the weapon, Russo!" the lead man shouted through the rain, struggling to aim through the downpour. "Hand over the girl and the baby, and Carlo might let you walk away." Dominic stood in front of Chloe, his broad shoulders shielding her completely from their line of sight. He didn't lower his gun. The rain slicked his dark hair to his forehead, and his eyes were pitch-black pools of murder. "Tell Carlo Moretti," Dominic yelled over the storm, his voice carrying the weight of an absolute death sentence, that he'd just signed his own death warrant. Before the hitmen could fire, the deafening roar of a twin-engine helicopter tore through the storm. A matte black tactical chopper ascended rapidly from the alleyway side of the building, its massive spotlight blinding the Moretti men. From the open side door of the chopper, Silas and 2 other heavily armed Russo enforcers opened fire with heavy suppression weapons. The air was ripped apart by the sound of automatic gunfire. The Moretti hitmen dove for cover, their screams lost to the wind and the roar of the rotors. The helicopter hovered just a foot above the edge of the roof. "Get in!" Dominic shouted, grabbing Chloe by the waist and practically lifting her off the ground. He shoved her into the secure cabin of the chopper. Silas reached out, pulling her and the baby inside. Dominic fired 3 more suppressive shots at the stairwell door, ensuring the remaining Moretti men stayed pinned down before leaping into the helicopter as it immediately banked hard away from the building. Chloe collapsed onto the leather seat of the chopper, shaking uncontrollably, her arms wrapped around the bundle of Dominic's coat and her sick baby. Dominic slid the heavy door shut, sealing them inside the soundproof, warm cabin. He holstered his weapon and immediately knelt in front of Chloe. He didn't look like a Mafia boss right now. He looked like a man who had just found his soul. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently pulling the blanket back from Leo's face. The baby was crying, the noise weak but alive. Dominic placed 2 fingers gently against the infant's chest, feeling the rapid, fighting heartbeat of his bloodline. Then Dominic looked up at Chloe. She was drenched, trembling and terrified, yet she possessed a strength he had never seen in anyone else. "You're safe," Dominic told her, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Both of you. No one will ever hurt you again. I swear it on my life." Chloe looked into his eyes, and for the first time in 14 grueling, solitary months of running, she finally believed it. The flight over the Chicago skyline was a blur of neon streaks and torrential rain beating against the reinforced glass of the helicopter. Inside the cabin, the roar of the rotors was muffled by high-grade acoustic paneling, leaving only the frantic, labored breaths of little Leo and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of Dominic Russo's silence. Dominic watched Chloe. She was huddled in the corner of the plush leather seat, his oversized midnight blue overcoat completely swallowing her small, trembling frame. She was clutching the baby with a white-knuckled grip, her eyes wide and fixed on Leo's flushed, sweating face. She didn't look at the sprawling city beneath them. She didn't look at Silas, who was methodically reloading a high-capacity magazine in the co-pilot seat. She was entirely consumed by the fragile life in her arms. "We're 3 minutes out, boss," Silas called over his headset. "Dr. Harrison is on the helipad. He's got the neonatal kit and the O2 ready. Tell him to prep a pediatric line for broad-spectrum cephalosporins," Dominic ordered, his voice cutting through the cabin with absolute authority. He turned his piercing gaze back to Chloe. "What exactly did the clinic doctor say? Don't leave out a single syllable." Chloe swallowed hard, her throat raw. Dr. Aris said it was a severe lower respiratory tract infection, progression towards pneumonia. He prescribed amoxicillin clavulinate, but I couldn't afford the copay. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her eyelashes, mixing with the drying rain on her cheeks. "I tried. I had the formula. I thought if I could just get the cash." Dominic shifted closer, the leather groaning under his weight. He reached out, his massive, scarred hand gently covering both of hers where they cradled the baby's head. The sheer heat radiating from his skin sent a jolt straight through her exhausted nervous system. "You kept him alive for 14 months against the entire Moretti syndicate," Dominic said softly, the lethal edge of his voice entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, grounding warmth. "You do not apologize for tonight. Do you understand me? You won the war, Chloe. My family will take over the battle now." Before she could process the weight of his words, the helicopter banked sharply, beginning its descent toward a massive, monolithic glass tower situated on the exclusive Gold Coast, the Astor Penthouse. It was the Russo family's most impenetrable fortress, registered under a web of shell corporations. The skids hit the illuminated helipad with a heavy thud. Instantly the side door was thrown open. The freezing wind howled, but Dominic was already moving. He unbuckled Chloe, virtually lifting her and the baby out of the cabin and into the blinding floodlights. Waiting for them was an older man with silver hair, wearing a tailored suit with his sleeves rolled up, flanked by 2 armed guards. Dr. Arthur Harrison had been the Russo family's premier physician for 3 decades. He didn't ask questions. He fixed bullet wounds, extracted shrapnel, and kept the bloodline breathing. "Inside, now!" Dr. Harrison commanded, rushing them towards the private elevator. The doors slid shut, and the opulent mahogany-paneled car shot downward. Chloe's ears popped. Within seconds, they stepped into a sprawling, hyper-modern penthouse that looked less like a home and more like an architectural masterpiece of marble, steel, and bulletproof glass overlooking Lake Michigan. But Chloe barely registered the luxury. Harrison directed them into a sprawling guest suite that had been rapidly converted into a sterile medical bay. An examination table sat under bright surgical lights. Oxygen tanks and heart monitors were already whirring to life. "Put him down here, sweetheart," Harrison said, his tone gentle but firm as he snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves. Chloe hesitated, her maternal instinct screaming at her to never let the child go, but Dominic stepped up behind her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a heavy, reassuring wall at her back. "Let him work, Chloe," Dominic murmured. With trembling hands, she laid the wailing, feverish infant onto the sterile paper of the exam table. Dr. Harrison moved with terrifying efficiency. He stripped away the damp blue blanket and the worn onesie, his stethoscope immediately pressing against Leo's tiny, heaving chest. Crackles in the lower left lobe, significant intercostal retractions. "He's fighting hard for air," Harrison muttered, his eyes darting to a pediatric pulse oximeter he clipped to Leo's tiny toe. The machine beeped frantically. "O2 saturation is at 86. Too low. Silas, hand me the pediatric mask." Silas, moving with surprising gentleness for a giant of a man, handed over a small, clear oxygen mask. Harrison fitted it over Leo's face. The hiss of pure oxygen filled the room, and almost instantly, the blue tint around the baby's lips began to recede into a pale pink. Chloe let out a choked sob, her knees finally buckling. Before she could hit the floor, Dominic caught her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, pulling her against the solid, warm expanse of his chest. "I've got you," he whispered, holding her upright. "I need to start an IV," Harrison announced, tearing open a sterile syringe and a vial of Rocephin. "He's severely dehydrated. I'm pushing fluids and a high dose of ceftriaxone." He's a tough kid, Dominic, but another 6 hours in that freezing apartment, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Dominic's jaw clenched so hard a muscle ticked visibly in his cheek. He looked down at the woman leaning against him. She was skeletal, her uniform stained and smelling of cheap diner grease, her collarbones sharp enough to cut glass. She had literally starved herself to keep a roof over his nephew's head. "How did you know my sister?" Dominic asked, his voice a low rumble vibrating against her back. Chloe couldn't tear her eyes away from the IV needle sliding into Leo's tiny vein, but she leaned into Dominic's strength. "I wasn't always a waitress," she whispered, her voice hollow. "My real name is Clara Hayes. I was a private neonatal nurse. Your sister, Isabella, she hired me off the books when she found out she was pregnant. She was terrified." Dominic's brow furrowed. Terrified of what? She was married. She was a Russo. "She was terrified of her husband," Chloe replied, turning her head slightly to look up at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Julian wasn't just a low-level associate, Dominic. Isabella found out he was funneling family secrets to Carlo Moretti. When she confronted him, he beat her. She knew Julian was planning to hand the baby over to Carlo as a bargaining chip to secure his own seat as a capo." Silence descended on the room, heavy and suffocating. Silas stopped near the doorway, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. Dominic's eyes darkened to the color of a thunderhead. "The car crash," Dominic stated, his voice devoid of all emotion, the most dangerous state for a man like him. "It wasn't an accident," Chloe confirmed, her voice trembling as the memories clawed their way to the surface. "Isabella called me that night in a panic. She said Julian had rigged her car, but she found out too late. She managed to escape on foot and made it to the private clinic where I was prepping the baby's incubator. She was bleeding. She handed me Leo, gave me that gold signet ring, and told me to run. She said to disappear completely, to become a ghost. Because the person helping Julian, the person who orchestrated the hit..." Chloe stopped, swallowing hard. "Who?" Dominic demanded softly, his grip on her waist tightening. "Who gave the order, Clara? Isabella said it was someone in your inner circle, someone with a lion tattoo on their forearm." The glass vial Dr. Harrison was holding shattered against the counter. Dominic didn't flinch. Silas went completely rigid. There was only one man in the entire Russo syndicate who bore the crest of the roaring lion tattooed on his right forearm. It was the man who had raised Dominic and Isabella after their father died, their uncle, Lorenzo Russo. The storm outside raged through the night, but inside the Astor penthouse, an entirely different kind of tempest was brewing. By 4 a.m., the crisis had passed. The heavy dose of IV antibiotics had worked a miracle on little Leo. His fever had broken, dropping to a manageable 99.2 degrees, and his breathing was slow and steady under the oxygen mask. He was sleeping deeply in a state-of-the-art crib that Silas had somehow procured in the middle of the night. Chloe had refused to leave the room. She was sitting in a plush velvet armchair pulled flush against the crib, her chin resting on the wooden railing. She had finally showered, trading her soiled, greasy waitress uniform for one of Dominic's soft, charcoal grey cashmere sweaters. It draped over her like a dress, the sleeves rolled up 4 times, smelling faintly of cedar and the intoxicating, spicy cologne the Mafia boss wore. The door to the suite clicked open softly. Dominic stepped inside. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the dark, muscular lines of his chest. He carried a silver tray holding a steaming mug of tea and a plate of warm, buttered toast. "You need to eat," Dominic said quietly, setting the tray on a small glass table beside her. Chloe looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the dim glow of the medical monitors. "I can't stomach anything. Every time I close my eyes, I see those men on the stairs. I see the guns." Dominic pulled up a chair opposite her, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. The space between them felt highly charged, crackling with an unspoken intimacy forged in the fire of surviving the night. "You don't have to look over your shoulder ever again, Clara," Dominic said, using her real name. The way it rolled off his tongue, rich and dark, made her heart skip a frantic beat. "I have 80 men heavily armed in the lobby, the garage, and the perimeter of this building. A fly doesn't land on this glass without my permission." "But your uncle," Chloe whispered, glancing nervously at the door. "If Lorenzo is the one who wanted Isabella dead, he'll know you have the baby now. He'll come for him." Dominic's expression hardened, a terrifying mask of cold, calculated vengeance settling over his features. "Let him come. I have already mobilized the capos, who are loyal strictly to me. Wyatt has been ripping through encrypted offshore accounts for the last 3 hours. He found the paper trail. Lorenzo paid Julian $2 million to sabotage Isabella's car, and he has been funneling Russo armaments to Carlo Moretti for a 20% cut of the Southside territory." Chloe shuddered. "Why? Why would he kill his own niece?" "Because Isabella was the rightful heir to our father's legitimate shipping empire," Dominic explained, his voice laced with venom. "I control the streets, but she controlled the clean money. Lorenzo wanted the shipping lanes to traffic Moretti's narcotics. Isabella found out and threatened to cut him off. So he ordered the hit. And he intended to use the baby, my blood, as leverage to force me into submission." He reached across the space between them, his large hand gently capturing hers. His thumb stroked the back of her knuckles, feeling the calluses she had developed from scrubbing diner tables and hauling trash, all to keep his nephew hidden. "You threw away your life," Dominic murmured, his stormy eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "You erased Clara Hayes. You lived in freezing slums, enduring abuse from petty bosses, starving yourself to buy formula. Why? You could have left him at a fire station. You could have walked away." Chloe looked down at their joined hands. The contrast was stark. His hands were weapons, scarred and powerful. Hers were delicate, bruised and trembling. Yet in his grip, she felt an overwhelming, terrifying sense of safety. Because when Isabella put him in my arms, he stopped crying and wrapped his little hand around my finger, Chloe said softly, a tear escaping and sliding down her cheek. "He didn't have anyone else in the world. And neither did I. My parents passed away when I was in nursing school. I know what it's like to be completely alone. I couldn't let him be alone. He became my son, Dominic. In every way that matters, he is my heart." Dominic stared at her, deeply moved. In his world, loyalty was bought with blood, fear, or cash. It was transactional, but this woman sitting before him possessed a profound, unbreakable loyalty, born entirely of love. It was a purity he had never encountered in the dark, violent underbelly of Chicago. Slowly, Dominic stood up. He gently pulled Chloe up with him. She was so small against his towering frame, the top of her head barely reaching his chest. "He is your son," Dominic declared, his voice a fierce, unyielding vow. "Blood does not make a mother. You did. And from this moment forward, Clara, you are under the protection of the Russo family. No one will ever disrespect you. No one will ever lay a hand on you." You will never look at a price tag, and you will never go hungry again. He lifted his hand, gently cupping her jaw. His thumb wiped away the tear on her cheek. The touch was impossibly tender for a man known to execute traitors with his bare hands. Chloe's breath hitched. She looked up into his eyes, seeing the raw, unmasked admiration and something deeper, something burning and possessive, staring back at her. The distance between them vanished as Dominic leaned in, his lips brushing the crown of her hair, lingering there as he breathed in the scent of her skin. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, her hands tentatively resting on his waist. Before Dominic could respond, the heavy oak doors of the suite burst open. Silas stood in the doorway, an assault rifle strapped across his chest, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was grim, entirely devoid of color. "Boss," Silas barked, the urgency in his voice shattering the quiet intimacy of the room. "We have a massive problem." Dominic immediately stepped back, his hand instinctively dropping to the Sig Sauer at his hip. "Report." "Wyatt just intercepted a wideband radio transmission from the south side," Silas said, stepping into the room and locking the door behind him. "Lorenzo knows you extracted the girl and the baby. He didn't just align with Carlo Moretti, Dominic. He merged with them. Lorenzo just put a $10 million bounty on Clara's head, and 50 of Moretti's heavily armed hitters just breached the lower parking garage of this building. They've disabled the elevators and cut the primary power." Right on cue, the lights in the penthouse flickered, buzzed, and died. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, flashing red emergency lights and the steady green glow of Leo's heart monitor. "They're coming up the emergency stairwells," Silas grimly concluded, "and we are heavily outnumbered." Dominic Russo didn't panic. The Mafia boss simply racked the slide of his pistol, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the red-lit room. He turned to Chloe, his eyes burning with lethal, terrifying resolve. "Stay with the boy," Dominic ordered softly. "I have a family reunion to attend." The Astor penthouse was bathed in the sinister, pulsating crimson of emergency backup lights. The rhythmic beep of Leo's heart monitor was the only sound of life in the sterile medical suite. Outside those reinforced doors, the silence was heavy, pregnant with the promise of absolute violence. In the shadowed living room, Dominic Russo shed his cashmere sweater, leaving him in a dark undershirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his torso. He checked his Sig Sauer, then retrieved a matte black M4 carbine. Silas stood by the reinforced steel doors of the primary stairwell, racking the bolt of his own heavy assault rifle. 48 hostiles, Silas reported, his earpiece glowing faintly. "They are moving fast. Lorenzo is with them, bringing up the rear with Carlo Moretti." A dark smile curved on Dominic's lips. Lorenzo always was a coward. Let them come. Back in the medical suite, Clara sat paralyzed, her eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany door. Dr. Harrison stood beside the crib, a compact revolver resting casually on the tray table. "Breathe, Clara," the elderly physician said smoothly. Dominic did not become the undisputed king of this city by losing on his home turf. This penthouse is a kill box. In the foyer, the steel doors groaned under a thermal breaching torch. With a deafening roar, they blew inward, a cloud of concrete dust and pulverized metal billowing into the penthouse. 10 heavily armored Moretti soldiers poured through the breach. They never took a second step. Silas opened fire from behind the granite kitchen island. The heavy caliber rounds tore through the dust, dropping the first wave. The noise was apocalyptic, a deafening symphony of shattering glass. The Moretti men returned blind fire, realizing too late they had stepped into a fatal choke point. Dominic stepped from the shadows, firing in precise, controlled bursts. Every shot found its mark. In less than 40 seconds, the first assault team was entirely neutralized. A sudden, eerie silence fell over the ruined room. Then the slow sound of clapping echoed from the stairwell. Through the thinning smoke, Lorenzo Russo stepped into the foyer. He wore a pristine grey suit, a silver revolver in his right hand. The roaring lion tattoo peeked out from his cuff. Behind him stood Carlo Moretti and 24 mercenaries, their weapons trained on Dominic and Silas. "Impressive, Dominic," Lorenzo rasped. "But you are outgunned. Hand over the boy. He is the key to a permanent peace with the Morettis." Dominic stood perfectly straight. "You killed Isabella for a trade route, Lorenzo. You betrayed our bloodline. There is no peace. There is only consequence." Lorenzo sneered, raising his revolver. "Kill them both." "Wyatt, now," Dominic said into his comms. Before a single trigger was pulled, the massive smart glass windows of the penthouse snapped from opaque to perfectly transparent. The laser sights of 40 high-powered sniper rifles painted the foyer in a sea of red dots. Every dot was centered on Carlo, Lorenzo, and their men. Dominic had drawn his elite syndicate guard to the perimeter. Carlo Moretti dropped his weapon in sheer panic. "Lorenzo, you old fool! You led us into a slaughterhouse!" "No," Lorenzo whispered, his face draining of color. "Dominic, wait. You made your choice the night you rigged Isabella's car." Dominic raised his Sig Sauer and fired a single shot. Lorenzo Russo collapsed to the marble floor. The architect of the family's misery was dead. Dominic turned to Carlo. "Take him to the warehouse," he ordered Silas. "The south side belongs to the Russos now." As the cleanup crew flooded the penthouse, Dominic walked down the shattered corridor and pushed open the door to the medical suite. Clara spun around, a fresh wave of terror flashing in her eyes. But when she saw Dominic, unharmed, the terror broke. She flew across the room, slamming into his chest, her arms wrapping fiercely around his neck. Dominic caught her, lifting her off the ground as he buried his face in the crook of her neck. "It's over," he breathed. "You never have to run again, Clara." Tears streamed down her face. "You actually saved us." "You saved my family first. Now, I am going to spend the rest of my life protecting yours." Dominic captured her lips with a desperate, consuming hunger. The kiss was a collision of relief, grief, and a fierce passion that anchored them to the new reality they had just fought to build. In the crib behind them, little Leo let out a soft sigh, entirely safe beneath the wings of the roaring lion. 1 year later, the harsh neon lights of Rosie's diner were a distant memory. Clara Russo stood on the sprawling balcony of the rebuilt Astor penthouse, bathed in the golden warmth of the summer sun. She wore a tailored silk dress, exuding the quiet power of the Russo family matriarch. Inside, Dominic sat on the floor, shedding his terrifying persona to build a tower of wooden blocks with a healthy, vibrant Leo. The toddler laughed, the heavy gold signet ring gleaming on a shortened chain around his neck. Dominic looked up, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's with a fierce, unwavering devotion. Resting on the mantelpiece, preserved perfectly under a glass cloche, was a crushed tin of baby formula, a quiet, permanent reminder that the greatest empires are sometimes built on the smallest, most desperate acts of love.